All right, so let's attempt the question. Which of the following sentences have the correct usage of punctuation? As always, read the question carefully. Is it asking to find the incorrect sentence or the correct sentence? So here you have to find the sentence with the correct punctuation. So three of them will have at least one inaccuracy, flaw, or any other um, issue, grammatical issue, and there will be one sentence which would be correct, which would be free of any such issue, right? So let's go through the options one by one. First one, Italy is famous for their composers and musicians, semicolon, France, comma, for their chefs and philosophers, semicolon, Poland for their mathematicians and logicians, full stop. So if you look at this sentence, it uses the semicolon. And you at least know this, that a semicolon indicates a pause that is more severe in, like, so to speak, than a comma, right? It indicates a greater pause than a comma, right? So even if you don't have an idea of the exact grammatical rules, right, there are main three principal uh, uh, conditions where cases where a semicolon is used, right? But even if you don't know those, I mean, those cases, the main one, even like the absolute main one, is that a semicolon is used to separate two independent clauses which are not linked by, say, a conjunction, right? And the second rule basically goes that a semicolon is used when there are two independent clauses, and uh, the second one has a word that connects it to the first one, a word like, say, moreover, or furthermore, or further, something that links back, harks back to the previous sentence, that invokes the previous sentence. So basically, even if you do not go into the technicalities, just oversimplifying it, explaining it in layperson terms, um, basically, anything that is separated by a semicolon should be a clause, right? It should be a clause. A clause is something that, you know, is somewhere between a sentence and a phrase. So a clause makes mostly makes sense on its own, right? And an independent clause is a clause that could have been a sentence, right? But the most essential thing is that a clause needs to have a verb. And mind it, verb here could also include is, was, you know, uh, so-called auxiliary verbs could also serve as a main verb. So be form of verb is also included here. Now, if these grammatical rules seem confusing, right? The best way to handle this is, if you're not particularly fond of memorizing grammatical rules or delving too deep into grammatical rules. If you feel they're too difficult to understand or too confusing or too much to remember, honestly, right? And there are too many exceptions. Then the best way to do it is to just read, right? When you read, you don't exactly know, at least consciously don't know why something is correct, but instinctively, whenever you see a sentence, you will know that, okay, this is a sentence structure that I've encountered previously, and this seems familiar. That's why it's important to build a library of thousands of sentence structures. And although the number seems daunting, right? Like reading just one article could give you a subconscious database of, or just back of the memory database of, like, say, 20 sentences, maybe even 50 sentences, right? So make sure you're reading three to five mid-sized, good quality intellectual articles from diverse fields every day, right? And if that is happening, you'll naturally know what is correct, even if you can't explain it to someone else, at least without conscious thought, that why it is correct. You can't, sometimes even when you think you don't know why it is correct, you just know it is correct, right? So that's good enough for solving questions in exams like this, right? Anyways, so when we see the first sentence, Italy is famous, it does have a verb, is, for their composers and musicians. Fair enough. Second, France, comma, for their chefs and philosophers, semicolon, Poland for their mathematicians and logicians. So in the other two clauses, right, again, right, they are separated by a semicolon, but could they have been sentences on their own? Like, suppose if you forget the other two, if it's just written France for their chefs and philosophers, does it make sense standalone in isolation? No, right? So it doesn't make sense to separate it with a punctuation mark like semicolon, right? Because if it is trying to stand on its own as a sentence, wannabe sentence, right? It doesn't even have a verb. A verb is the minimum that a sentence should have, right? It's often said that go exclamation mark is the shortest sentence in the English language, right? Just one verb. So even a noun is not necessary, right? So apart from these handful of exceptions, what is essential in a sentence is there being a subject and a verb, right? The subject can be implied or implicit, as in when they say go exclamation mark as an exclamatory sentence or imperative sentence as a command, then you go, you, the pronoun, is the sort of hidden subject, and like, um, who is receiving the command, or rather, I'm the person who's uttering the command, and the person in front is receiving the command. So it's a command line. You should go. That part is hidden and it's just go. So a verb is essential for the formation of a sentence. The only part of speech that is absolutely essential, absolutely necessary, without which a sentence cannot be formed. No kind of sentence, not even exceptions, is a verb. Right. So since there is a semicolon, which is a major separator, more major than a comma, so to speak, then because this sentence needs to stand on its own, it needs a verb. Otherwise, France for their chefs and philosophers. What? France is known for their chefs and philosophers, or France is notorious for their chefs and philosophers, or France is not known for their chefs and philosophers. How do I know what action is being performed, right? So that's why A is incorrect, because it's using a semicolon when these clauses are not independent clauses. Even if you don't understand what independent clauses are, it's completely fine, right? What you need to understand, even intuitively, is that the sentence lacks a verb and it is separated by semicolon, so it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? All right, let's move on to the next option. Uh, Italy is famous for its composers and musicians, France for its chefs and philosophers, and Poland for its mathematicians and logicians. Here, it's pretty much the previous option, except that there are semicolon, there are commas in place of semicolons, right? So Italy is famous for its composers and musicians, comma, France for its chefs and philosophers, comma, and Poland for its mathematicians and logicians. So this is a list. Like if you look at the broad hierarchy, the top level of the hierarchy, it is a list of three items, right? Italy, something about France, and something about Poland. So these are the three items in that list. And within those items, with two of them, there are commas inside, like second level commas. Now, those commas are not listing commas, but pause commas. So why does France have a comma after it? Right? To give you an idea that what is there in the previous sentence is to be understood here. So repetition is explicitly avoided by putting a comma there. So you understand, okay, France for its chefs and philosophers. So like for example, just as an example, when we have to repeat something, if the answer to two questions is same, or if the same process is repeated, like say you're filling data in a table manually, right? Like on paper, that's something you used to do in school. We used to write do, right? In the fields. Like if it's the form, it's tedious to fill, you write do, like a dash, do, and a dash. Or you used to just, put say, a double inverted comma, right? A single double quote to indicate that something is repeated, right? I hope you remember that. So it's very similar, right? So Italy is famous for its composers and musicians, comma. Now, France for its chefs and philosophers is fine because although it doesn't have a verb, it's not claiming to be a sentence. It's not claiming to be a wannabe sentence. It's not claiming to be an independent clause. It's not trying to stand on its own because it is only separated by a comma. It is still one full sentence, right? It's one whole sentence. So parts of a whole sentence lacking a verb is completely fine, right? It's not like France for its chefs and philosophers and Poland for its mathematicians and logicians are trying to stand on their own. They're not. That's why they're not separated by semicolons, right? So they are just phrases, right? Or they're not even like clauses, not even dependent clauses, not even subordinate clauses because they lack a verb, right? So they are just phrases, and that's perfect. And since there are a list of three items, so suppose there's a list of n items, then the n, like before the n minus 1th item, like after the n minus 1th item and before the nth item, we place a comma and an and, right? A comma before an and. That's called the Oxford comma. So it's not absolutely binding. So certain rules allow it to not be there, but it is considered to be a good thing to do in general. Again, there is a lot of disagreement over it, but as the story goes, people who put a comma before the last item in the list, before the and, right? Suppose you have seven things, right? Monday, comma Tuesday, comma Wednesday, and so on. So Friday, comma Saturday, and Sunday. So if you put a comma before the and that precedes Sunday, then that's considered the mark of a scholar or an intellectual. Right. I mean, that used to be the case, and that's why it's called Oxford comma. Like Oxford being a byword for scholarly or in well educated or intellectual. Right. So writing Friday, comma Saturday and Sunday is also fine. But writing Friday, comma Saturday, comma and Sunday, so putting a comma before the nth element and after the n minus 1th element is considered a good practice. So if you have a list of seven items, you put commas everywhere. You should also optionally, like, to be more, uh, how do I put it? To be more compliant, right? Put a comma before the and, right? We usually think that when a list is when we have reached the last element of a list, we don't need to put a comma before that. Just the and will do. Putting a comma before and, it's called the Oxford comma, is a good practice. So yeah, so option B is correct, right? Okay, let's move to option C. Italy is famous for its composers and musicians, France for its chefs and philosophers, Poland for its mathematicians and logicians. So here, again, now this is similar to B, except for one thing. There are no commas after France and Poland. Now, since there are no commas after France and Poland, a very simple way to look at it, apart from all the explanation that I've already given, is that the things separated by commas should be similar items, right? So if you have a laundry list, items are similar, they're objects, right? If there's a list of countries, they're all countries. Now, here are the three things comparable. So if you look at the comma separated items, there are three items. One of them has a verb, the other two don't, right? The other two don't. Now, this is different from the case with one, right? So in one, they were claiming to be clauses. Now, you can always say that in option C, they are not claiming to be clauses, and that is correct. So option C is better than option A in the regard that it does not have a semicolon, and the parts are not claiming to be clauses. But then again, the paths are not equivalent, right? So what is difference? What is the difference here? Is that the comma in option B after France and Poland was a stand-in, was an indicator for the fact that the same action has to be repeated or understood. Like option B is basically telling you that when I write comma after France, you have to understand it means France is famous for its chefs. So the same principal verb that is there in the first part is also to be copied, like while interpreting in part 2 and part 3 of the list, right? But option C is not giving us any such indication. So in option C, is famous for is only belonging to the first part of the sentence. That is, Italy is famous for its composers and musicians. Now, since there is no comma after France and Poland, and that comma is not a comma to separate a list, that comma is to indicate a pause and to, more importantly, to indicate to the interpreter that the same action has to be interpreted again. So that comma is missing. So I'll just take it as France for its chefs and philosophers, which again itself does not mean anything. So the three items are not comparable because there is no stand-in for the action after France and Poland. So in very simple terms, in option B, right, is famous for, that part is to be understood to also be copy pasted for the second part, which has France, and the third part, which is for Poland. How do we know that we have to copy paste it? Because there is that comma which is invoking that action. But in option C, is famous for as an action is isolated to Italy. And there is nothing in the second and third part, that is for France and Poland respectively, that is asking us to copy paste the same verb, copy paste the same action denoted by the verb is famous for. So we don't know whether what it is telling us about France and Poland. We know in option C what it is telling about Italy, but it is isolated to that segment. It can't cross the barrier of the main commas, right? Right. So if you want to understand it in more abstract terms, you can take it like, for example, if I write this expression, 3 into, say, okay, let's take another example. Let's take, suppose I say 4 into 1 plus 2 plus 3. Just like option B. If I use the distributive property, I know I have to do 4 into 1 plus 4 into 2 plus 4 into 3. Right? So I know that the 4 is supposed to be multiplied with each element in that bracket, in that sum. Right? Each component of that sum has to be multiplied with 4. Not just the one, just because it is next to it, but to all. So the 4 here is famous for. And the 1, 2, 3 are like the paths for Italy, France, and Poland. Right? So one is Italy, France is Poland, France is 2, and Poland is 3. And the 4 is famous for. So I know I have to apply is famous for to all three paths. Right? Now compare this with the algebraic expression 4 into 1 plus 2 plus 3. When you apply BODMAS, the answer will be 4 into 1. That's it. 4 plus 2 plus 3. So it will be 9. It won't be 24 as in the first expression. So the first expression is like option B. It is to be applied to all three. And how do we know that? We know that because of these commas right here, right? And since there are no commas here, I just take it as 4 into 1 plus 2 plus 3. And that's why 4 doesn't get multiplied with the other two. I hope that analogy clarifies things a little, right? And again, as I say, rather than you know delving too much into the rules and grammatical intricacies, it is always better to simply uh, acquaint yourself with language by habituating yourself, with reading and listening and even speaking, but most importantly, reading, so that these sentence structures come naturally to you, right? I'll just clear the annotations. Yeah. So, okay, now let's look at option D. Italy is famous for its composers and musicians. I think this just exaggerates the point that I made for. So, if the option with semicolon is wrong, here we have a graver version of the semicolon, a more severe version of the semicolon, right? Which indicates a full stop, the period, the full stop, right? So, what like the exact same explanation for A is even better illustrated, is even more aggravated in option D. The problem because of which we eliminated A is only aggravated in option D, right? So France for its chefs and philosophers is not only trying to be a sentence, it is a sentence and it is essentially incomplete because it doesn't have a verb. So it can't be a sentence, right? So France for its chefs and philosophers is an incomplete sentence, is not a sentence, right? And it is meaningless. It's hollow. Poland for its mathematicians and logicians. Again, since it is separated by full stop, the problem becomes the problem that was there in option A and was the basis for its elimination has only intensified in option D because we go from that from comma to semicolon to full stop in increasing degree of severity, right? So complete independence. So there is nothing that will help this sentence out because the verb cannot even cross a period, right? So it won't come and apply. It is not being referred to by the other two parts. So the other two parts are just vague. It's only one sentence. Italy is famous for its composers and musicians. That's it. The rest of it is essentially gibberish, right? So D is absolutely incorrect. Now let's look at option E. Italy is famous for their composers and musicians, semicolon. France for their chefs and philosophers, semicolon. Poland for their mathematicians and logicians. Now, I guess this is trying to mix things up. So I think I have already explained the basis for like E has a flaw of option A and also has the flaw of option C, right? So E combines the flaws of option A and option C, right? And it's the, you know, um, so kind of makes a double sin, two different kinds of sin, right? So yeah, that's all. So option E is obviously wrong because we have already shown why option A and C are wrong. So the only correct option is option B. So B is the correct way of punctuating the sentence, right? I hope it's clear. Option E is just a simple mix of option A and C, and since we have proven that both A and C are wrong, right? D is a graver version of option A. So the only option that is remaining, and I've already discussed why it is correct as well, is option B.